And so we'd like to thank Lisa Howse from the Saskatchewan Waste Reduction Council for joining us today to talk composting. I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, awesome. Live television. It's okay. So I'm very happy to be with you today. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking us through an introduction to composting. And the sort of basic outline of our workshop today is we're going to be talking through the reasons for composting, what the actual benefits of it are. Then I'm going to talk about a few different methods that can be used to get started. Obviously, the most common one we're going to talk about is compost bins. We are also going to talk about vermicomposting, which is an indoor type of composting that uses earthworms. And then we're going to touch on some other methods, depending on where we're at, how much time we have. So, as I said, starting on reasons to compost, I usually like to break this down into 3 categories. And so the 3 we can talk about, one, the most simple, is literally just to be making less garbage. This one is quite intuitive. When we're throwing fewer things into the trash can and putting them somewhere else, we end up with less trash. It is pretty significant, though, in that it turns out in, oh, sorry. So, my apologies. For talking about reasons to compost, the first one we talk about is specifically just making less garbage. It makes a lot of sense. You're throwing away fewer things. We're not making as much trash that way, but there are some benefits to making less trash. The biggest one, actually, people often think that this reason is mainly environmental, but the truth is making less trash, one of the biggest benefits to it is actually to do with municipal economics, believe it or not, in that it turns out dealing with garbage in a responsible and environmentally safe way is a little bit expensive. And so a lot of communities, especially small communities, are really interested in ways that we can cut down on the amount of garbage that we're making so that we don't have to deal with as much, don't have to have the transfer station emptied as often, and have a landfill last longer. And so taking out things that are easily used for something else that don't have to be waste is a really good first step. Obviously, one of the ways people do this is recycling, taking out things like good paper, cardboard, metal. But another way is to take out things that can be composted and to, instead of making them trash, turn them into soil. So this is one major reason, is just making less waste, having less garbage to deal with. A second reason that we've got, this one is the more environmentally focused one, is that it turns out material that can rot, things like food waste, dead plants, grass leaves, even dirty paper, takeout paper containers and stuff like that, they don't always rot the same way. If they're in an environment where there's lots of air, lots of oxygen, they rot in a really easy way. It only takes a few months. They turn into soil, basically. Not very much gases are released. And that's what we want to have happen. But in different circumstances, specifically, if things like food waste and plants are rotting and there isn't a lot of oxygen around, say they're buried really deep in a landfill or they're submerged in water or something like that. So if they are in a situation without a lot of oxygen, they actually rot very slowly. It can take as much as some decades for things to fully break down. And as well as that, instead of just turning into soil, they turn into a lot of byproducts that we don't like. A lot of different kinds of pollution that aren't great for our earth and for our environment. So without oxygen, things rot into stuff like methane gas, ammonia, something called hydrogen sulfide gas, which some people call rotten egg gas, and different pollutants that are both not great for the water table. They can cause, sorry, not water table, just for the water ecosystem. If ammonia gets into water, it can cause algae blooms and stuff like that. And it's also, the methane gets up into the air, and unfortunately, it is one of the greenhouse gases that contributes to climate change. So if we can, it always makes more sense, takes better care of our planet, if we're able to take the things that can rot, like food waste, like plants, and make sure that they rot somewhere where they have lots of air, lots of oxygen. Because again, with oxygen, we just get nice compost and soil. Without oxygen, we get all this methane and ammonia and other stuff. And I'll talk more about the reasons for that later. But the basics of it is that the actual rotting that happens is being done by tiny living creatures. It's being done by bacteria, it's being done by fungus, and they need certain things in their environment in order to work right. So one of the things they need is oxygen. So we have two reasons so far. We talked about making less garbage, and we talked about basically making sure things rot with oxygen so we don't get all that methane and stuff. The third thing that we're going to talk about is that the actual soil we get from compost, when we do it right, is really, really helpful to us. So anytime that we are interested in the environment and we want to take care of the animals and we want to take care of the plants and we want to take care of everything in our environment, one of the things we have to think about is the soil. How healthy is the soil? Because in the end, all the things that we have that are growing will come out of the soil. So we want to make sure that the soil has everything it needs to be full of food and to be a healthy living ecosystem. And one of the ways we can do that is by adding compost. Compost, when it's fully broken down, is a mixture of really rich organic matter that's all full of food, all full of nutrients, all full of nice structure to help the soil be fertile and fluffy. And it's also full of tons of living organisms, things like beneficial bacteria, things like little strands of fungus, things like amoebas and nematodes and insects, and all of these little living creatures in the compost are the ones that help the soil itself to grow a living, thriving ecosystem. And the reason that's important is that when we have a living system in the soil, it does all kinds of things to take care of the environment. Living, healthy soil breaks down nutrients into a form that can be used again. So they recycle old dead matter into new nutrients for plants. They also help support the health of plants and feed them. The truth is, many plants actually can't easily eat the nutrients and the food in the soil unless they have bacteria and other organisms to help them. And a final thing that it does as well is that organic matter and living ecosystems in the soil is actually one of the best, healthiest, and safest places in the world for us to store carbon. So if we're worried about, as we should be, too much carbon in the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide, one of the big places that we can say, oh, here is a safe place for us to tuck carbon away, where it will not only be safe, but actually actively helpful. One of the best places we can do is to tuck it into the soil. And compost and other forms of organic soil amendments are a great way to do that. So I know that's a lot of information, all very fast, but just as a very quick summary, talking about the reasons for composting, we have one, just to make a lot less garbage, which is honestly just helpful to both schools, residences, municipalities, anyone who has to take care of the waste stream. Number two is because food waste, yard waste, food and plants, they don't rot very well in a landfill. In a landfill without oxygen, they make a lot of pollution. So it's better to put them somewhere that they'll rot in a good way and not make methane. And number three is because we get a fantastic soil amendment in the form of compost that we can use to make sure both our wild areas or agricultural areas, the soil remains healthy, it's taken care of, it has a living ecosystem. These are the three big reasons that we have for composting. And now I'm going to, A, check how long I've talked about that, and B, we're going to talk a little bit about specific methods that we can use for composting. So if we are like, okay, you know, I want to take my food waste, I want to take my grass or leaves or plant waste, I don't want to put that in the trash, I want to make compost out of it. So what ways can we do that? The first one I'm going to talk about is compost bins. So compost bins are probably the most common form that people think about. Compost bins, I have a couple of examples here that I'll bring right on over, are just large containers, typically kept outside in a garden, in a yard, in a back alley, wherever, that we simply pile our food waste and plant waste into and give it time for the microbes to break it down. 1 second here, just grab another one. So the first thing I want to say about compost bins is, in spite of the fact that there are many, many different kinds that you can build or buy or improvise, the truth is the bin itself is not very important. Compost bins are really just a glorified box to hold your material and keep it tidy while you are having the microbes break it down. The real work that's happening in a compost is all being done by living organisms. So the important thing is creating an environment where the decomposition bacteria, decomposition fungus, and as well as other bigger things like again, we've got those protozoa, those ciliates, the nematodes, basically things that you can study under a microscope. We need to make the right environment for them to thrive so that they can multiply, eat, and transform the material that's inside of the compost bin. All of the work is being done by these microbes. So the box itself, it's just a box. What really matters is how we balance the material inside of it. The nice thing about that is it means that if you're getting started, you don't have to buy an expensive compost bin. You can build a little compost bin out of pallets, out of fencing, out of wire, out of cinder block, whatever kind of stuff you have around, just to keep it neat and tidy. In fact, if you are out in the countryside, a lot of times people will just compost in a heap on the ground. Typically in municipal areas, we do use a bin because a lot of times there's bylaws and things like that. And the other thing to keep in mind is if you're composting in country where we have black bears or even grizzly or polar bears, then we need to make sure that our composting area is a little more bear-proof than just a pile on the ground. To balance the material inside of the compost bin, I'm going to talk now, this is really the most important part of the whole workshop, so everybody tune in right here. I'm going to talk about the basic recipe for balancing what's inside of a compost bin. It has 5 ingredients, and I'm just going to put a few of them out right here once I get to them. The first thing we're going to talk about is the actual plant's food, you know, the material you think about going into the compost bin. So everything that can go into the compost has to be something that can easily rot, which means it has to be something bacteria and fungus can eat and transform. But we kind of take all of that stuff and we group it into 2 categories, roughly. And they're categorized technically what it actually is. If you were to take all of these little things like apple cores, leaves, banana peels, eggshells, and get them tested in a lab, the way we're categorizing them has to do with how much or how little nitrogen they have in them. So on one end of the spectrum, we have things that have a whole lot of nitrogen, and that's things like food waste, so all of our fruits, vegetables, coffee grounds. It'll also have things like green plants, anything like green plants from a garden, or green weeds, dandelions, thistles, grass clippings if you have them, even stuff like manure. So chicken manure, pig manure, cow manure, all of this kind of stuff, very high in nitrogen. And for that reason, it gets to be one category of what we put in that compost. And we call it green material. It's kind of just a shorthand. You can think of it as the fresh stuff that's high in nitrogen. And then we put everything else into the other category, which we would call brown material. And this is things that are pretty low in nitrogen, but they have lots of carbon. So it's stuff like leaves, straw, paper actually is a really good one, or cardboard. It can even be stuff like wood chips or sawdust, but things that are more dead and woody in nature. And so we call all of that stuff brown materials. And the biggest trick to composting in a compost bin is to keep those two balanced off each other. So if we have a bin and it's all sticks and wood and paper and straw, all brown materials, it'll break down very, very slowly because it's lacking the fuel that really gets it going. But if we have a bin that's entirely stuff like banana peels, green grass clippings, and stuff like that, while it'll break down quickly, it'll also have a pretty strong smell because it has more nitrogen than the bacteria can handle. So the truth is, if you want to keep a compost bin in balance, where it's really, really breaking down as quickly as possible, but also it doesn't have any kind of a noticeable smell, the best way to do that is to make sure we add about half things that are high in nitrogen or considered green materials, and about half things that are high in carbon, low in nitrogen, things considered brown materials. What that looks like in practice usually is that we'll keep some of those woody, dead brown materials stored up for when we need them. We'll keep a bag of leaves, or we'll keep a pail of sawdust or something like that. And then each time we put in some food waste or some green plants, we'll just put the same amount of brown material on top. That's the first two ingredients, and they are very important. I'm also just going to get some examples out here because I'd like to talk about those ingredients in a little bit more depth. So like I said, everything we're putting in compost, it has to be stuff that can rot easily. When it comes to plants, that's really simple. Plants are pretty much all okay to go into that compost bin. So we have some green plants here, we've got some grass, some dandelions, some clover. A little bit harder to find this time of year than it is at other times of years, but we've still got some. Live television.
That's why we have to start. Don't need to worry.
No worry. All right, so we've got our green grass and things like that. This would be a green material, high in nitrogen. We also have some dead plants. So I've got some sunflower stalks. I've got some leaves. Got some wood chips, some sticks. So all of this stuff, this would count as brown materials. It's more dead, more woody. It evens out the green material. One thing I will say as well, softer things like grass and leaves break down fully in a single round of composting. Things that are a little tougher, like sticks or wood chips, these might only about half break down in a single round of composting. So often after you've made some compost, you'll still find little bits of wood, pine cones, peach pits. The tougher stuff is really still present in the finished compost, and that's completely normal. It doesn't harm the finished compost at all. The plants will not mind it. But if you want your compost to have a very fine, almost silky texture, then you just put it through a sieve to take out any little chunks that are left. But that's completely aesthetic. There's no mandatory reason to do that. Okay, so we've got our plants, and again, plants in general, totally okay to go into the compost. Some people get a little bit nervous about adding weeds into the compost, things like dandelions or thistles or portulaca. It's sort of something you get to make your own standards on. You can think of every dandelion you pluck has a lot of nutrients in it, that if that dandelion was broken back down into compost, those nutrients will now be available to the other plants that you're growing. But also sometimes plants like dandelions and thistles might have seeds. And if you put it in the compost, while most of it will break down into nutrients, the seeds, they're pretty tough and hardy. So they might make it all the way through. And at the end, you might have this lovely soil amendment ready to be used in a garden or whatever. But it might also have some dandelion seeds in it. So some people set the standard that they say, no weeds at all. I will not put any weeds into my garden. I will not put any weeds into my compost. And some people say, no, I don't want to waste the nutrients that are in those weeds. And I also don't want to fuss about what does and doesn't go in my compost. And so they just put in everything. And the truth is both techniques are just fine. I'm definitely more in the second camp, where I tend to go for just weeds can go in the compost and that's fine. If they came from my garden, then I know that I already have those weed seeds in my garden. And so it's maybe not worth worrying about. So that's to do with plants. The other things I want to mention are food waste and paper waste. So when it comes to food waste, we can group food waste into things that are and aren't easy to break down. Generally, as long as it comes from plants, it'll be easy to break down. So what does that mean? It can mean things that are made out of flour or seeds. So stuff like rice, cereal, or in this case, a little bit of bread. If it's gone moldy, that's fine. It can still be composted. And in general, things that are starting to go moldy, it just means they're getting a head start on the composting. They're already starting to rot. It's not going to hurt the compost. You can absolutely still put it in. Other stuff that we got that can go really easily, fruits and vegetables, either in whole or in part, cooked or raw, it's all fine. So I have a banana peel here to represent that. A couple more things. I've got an orange peel. Other stuff I've got is coffee grounds. So coffee grounds are totally okay to go into the compost. They're made out of beans to begin with, coffee beans to be specific. And you can even put them in with the paper filter. That's fine too. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And the last thing that I want to mention in terms of coming from plants is tea leaves. Tea leaves and tea bags. Another one usually comes from leaves, sometimes has paper around it. That's totally okay. These can be composted really easily as well. So in general, we're looking at fruits, vegetables, coffee waste, tea waste, as well as things made out of grains. All of those things break down really easily, and I'm going to add one more to that category, even though it doesn't come from plants. One more thing that goes in the compost and breaks down very, very easily, no problems, eggshells. So we can add eggshells in as well. They're just a nice source of calcium in the soil. The reason I'm emphasizing all of these as being things that are good to go in is that there are some kinds of food waste that are a little more difficult to break down. They do break down eventually. They do rot into compost eventually, but it takes longer, and it can produce a pretty strong, pretty bad smell while it's happening. And those, I'm just going to have a little seat again, those are things mostly that have a lot of grease or a lot of protein in them. So we're talking about stuff like cheese, meat, bones, maybe even something like used cooking oil. So all of that kind of stuff that's made out of milk, it's made out of meat, it's made out of oil. It doesn't compost as easily. It's much harder to do. And so usually when we're doing compost at home, we'll just say to leave it out. And the reason is that we don't want to make our compost bins have a strong, bad smell. And secondly, we don't want to put that stuff in meat, bones, and dairy because it's very attractive to animals. And so anything from little mice to coyotes to, of course, things like bears, even birds, even stray dogs, just almost any animal will think, oh, I smell chicken bones, I need to investigate. And so in order to just avoid those troubles, we often say if you've got stuff like chicken bone waste or meat scraps or stuff like that, we might still put it just in the regular garbage or at least in a different kind of compost. Yeah. Okay, so food waste, plant waste, and then the last thing I want to talk about is paper waste. Paper, I really like doing this part when I'm talking to classes of kids, so I get to say, who knows what paper's made out of? And they go, oh, maybe. And it's made out of plant fiber. It's made out of wood. It's made out of bamboo. Sometimes it's even made out of rice stalks. But it's made out of plant fiber to start with. And that means that paper, in general, actually rots very, very easily. Bacteria and fungus can break it right down as if it's just thin little sheets of plants, basically. And so there's lots of kinds of paper we can put in the compost as well. Basically anything that isn't lined with plastic. And you can usually tell by if you try to tear the item and it won't tear, That often means that it's got a plastic liner on it, so it's maybe not great to go into the compost. But if it does tear fairly easily, it's generally okay. So cardboard's fine, box board is fine, napkins, paper towel, newspaper, even white office paper can be composted. Sometimes at this point in the workshop, kids will ask me, well, hang on, we've got a recycling bin and it says to put the paper in the recycling bin. Should we compost our paper or should we recycle our paper? The answer there is that both things are very good to do. If you have paper or cardboard that is nice and clean, doesn't have grease or food or dirt on it, then that's fantastic for recycling. You can compost it if you want, but that clean paper, clean cardboard, it's great to recycle it if that's available too. However, if you have, say, napkins or paper towels or a pizza box that have, you know, food, grease, dirt on them, they're not very good for recycling because they don't make a nice clean stock for whatever they're making next out of the recycling. But those things are totally okay to be composted. So in the waste management field, they often refer to these as soiled paper, which is to say paper that's dirty. So dirty paper is very, very good for composting as well. So now I've gone over the things that we would generally put in there. We've got green plants and even sometimes including weeds and things like that. We've got old dead woody plants, everything from literal pieces of wood to leaves and straw. We've got food waste. We talked a little bit about what kinds are really easy to break down and which kinds are a little trickier, so we usually leave them out. And we've got paper waste as well. I'll also now just group these and say all of this food waste and the green plants, we're going to count this as that nitrogen-rich green material. And all of this dead plants and paper waste, we're going to count that as the not much nitrogen, lots of carbon, brown material. And so, again, if I was making compost in a compost bin, the first thing I would think about is, okay, I need to balance these two against each other. About roughly half and half by volume. It's not an exact science. If you're off by a few percentage points, nothing bad will happen. But doing that means that your compost will break down quickly and it will have very little smell. So it's a great idea. Oh, okay. And so layers within layers. What I'm talking about right now, so as a recap, is compost bins and how to balance the material inside of them. The first thing that I was saying was the 5-step recipe to balance them. And even though we've taken a long time to do it, the first 2 things of this 5-step recipe are green material and brown material. Now we'll talk about the other 3 things. And so the other 3 things are all simpler. Good news. One of them is just water. Now water, the reason water is important is, again, it's one of the things that our healthy community of microbes, bacteria, and fungus require in order to thrive and eat and transform the materials and change them into soil. If the material is dry, if there's not really much water present, all that happens is that decomposition slows down and maybe ultimately even stops. So if we have a compost pile, you know, it's a nice mix of food waste and leaves and grass and straw, but it's really dry, we can basically think of it as just being asleep or dormant. The microbes won't have died, but the microbes will be very, very sleepy, very lethargic. They won't be doing much at all. And so one of the big things in a prairie climate is that we want to sometimes add water to our compost in order to keep it damp. It's nice that it isn't as, it's not as urgent as watering a plant, in that for a plant, you know, something growing outside, if we don't water it at all for a week or 2 and it's been really hot and it's been really dry, then that plant might not make it. And it's possible that by the end of the hot, dry weeks, the plant itself may have perished, may have died. And then if we water it after the fact, it won't bring it back. Compost isn't like that. in that even if it's been dry for weeks or months or even years, the microbes are still present. And all we need to do is get the material wet again, and it will start to process again. So we have a lot of forgiveness on this one. In general, though, we say if you can, to go out and get the compost soaked all the way through, or at least nice and damp, every month, and between every 2 to 4 weeks is what we usually say during the summertime. Don't need to worry about it in the winter. In the winter, everything just freezes, goes into hibernation until spring, so we don't worry about watering it. So water is one really big thing, and it'll have a lot to do with how quickly you get finished compost. We have green material, brown material, water. The last two I'm going to talk about are air and regular soil. So air, we've already talked a little bit about why the air is important for our compost. We talked about it when I mentioned that things rot differently in different circumstances. And in particular, that if things don't have a lot of oxygen around, don't have a lot of air, then the bacteria and the fungus that normally help to break things down, they struggle. And other bacteria that don't need oxygen take over. And they break things down slowly and make a lot of byproducts like methane. So ideally, we want to have tons of air available so that the microbes we like, which breathe oxygen, can thrive and multiply and transform the material. What this means in an actual compost bin is that sometimes we need to think about, can I add more air to this compost? The outside edges of a compost bin will typically have tons of air. They'll have little vents, little gaps, and air will come and go in the top 9 inches of compost or so. But underneath that, we occasionally might want to think to do something to refresh the air that's there. So there's a couple of different methods that I'll show. Just going to grab a couple things here. One of the simpler ones is passive, which is to say we build it in and then we don't have to do anything else. So if we have a compost bin and we want to make sure it has lots of air going to the center of the compost bin, then when we're starting to build our compost pile, we could take a piece of pipe, any leftover piping from renovations, from building. You can also often purchase piping from different hardware stores for very, very cheap. And then we've poked lots of holes in it. So I've used a drill to poke about 1 centimeter large holes every few centimeters down the pipe on different sides. So what I've created is called an aeration pipe. And I can take this, I can put it in the center of my compost bin and build the pile around it. And it just acts like basically a drinking straw for air, or a breathing tube for air. That makes more sense. And so we can make sure that the center of the pile always has enough air diffusing into it through these holes. That's one really easy way to do it. The second way that people sometimes will do is that they'll simply physically stir the compost every now and again. How we're doing? Yeah.
Yeah,
All right.
doing great.
Wonderful. And so physically stirring the compost, obviously it's more work, but we don't need to do it very often. Every 2 to 4 weeks is usually plenty. You can do it a little more if you want to get a bit more of exercise in your garden, but you don't have to. And so the reason I have 2 different tools here, if you have a style of compost bin that's kind of vertical, and you have to stir it vertically. So a little plastic compost bin or something like that, where you have to go in through the top. This kind of compost bin, it works best to actually get a special tool called a compost aerator. And that's what this is. So this one, it's been around a while. You can tell by the dirt and the rust on the bottom, but they last forever. A compost aerator is, you can think of it a lot like a harpoon, actually. It's long, metal, skinny, pointy at the end, and it has these hooks down here. But the trick is the hooks can fold down or fold up. So when you push it into the compost, the hooks fold up. So it's just a nice pointy tool that goes right down to the bottom of the compost bin. And then when you pull it out again, using the handle at the top, these wings fold down, which helps them to stir everything on the way up. It is so much easier to use one of these than to try and work with a different tool in a vertical compost bin. Something like a pitchfork tends to go in about that far, it gets stuck, and then you just can't do anything else. However, if you have the style of compost bin that's stirred horizontally from the front, so something more like this one, this compost bin here, where the idea is that you can take out the front slats in order to get in and stir it horizontally. In that case, something like a pitchfork or a shovel is your best bet, and it works just as well. It's only the vertical ones that we say are a bit challenging to do that way. So now I'm going to move these props out of the way. That's how we think about air. So now we've covered 4 different things in the 5-step recipe. We've talked about green and brown materials, which should be roughly even by volume in there. We've talked about water, where every 2 to 4 weeks during the warm part of the year, we'll add enough water to make sure that the material is damp, like a wrung out washcloth or a freshly watered plant. And also, we'll either build in a little bit of an aeration pipe, or every 2 to 4 weeks, again, we might give the compost a little stir. You don't have to like completely flip over the whole compost pile. You just want to give it 3 or 4 or 5 pokes with the compost aeration tool, or 3 or 4 little tosses with the garden fork in order to just refresh the air that's in it. The last step, which is probably the most optional one, is a little bit of regular dirt or previously finished compost. The reason we do this is it's a microbe booster. So it's sort of like putting a little bit of your old sourdough starter into your new batch of sourdough. Is it just kickstarts the multiplication of microbes. So dirt itself, regular soil from the ground is what I mean to say. So just going outside and taking a scoop of dirt from the ground is very, very full of living organisms. Again, we've got that whole healthy ecosystem going in our living soils. We've got bacteria, we've got fungus, we've got nematodes, we've got ciliates, we've got small insects, we've got earthworms sometimes. It depends on which biome you're in, whether you actually have earthworms. A lot of northern climates actually don't have earthworms native at this time, and that's fine. And when we add these in to our regular compost, they spread out, they multiply, they thrive, and they just help things to break down. You can get away without ever adding any dirt or previously finished compost, but it's just a booster that helps things to go quicker. Again, we only say every 2 to 4 weeks, and usually we just go maybe a liter of dirt, a trowel full of dirt. It doesn't take a lot. In fact, if we add too much dirt, say we had a compost pile that was half dirt, it'll actually slow down the decomposition. So we do want to have just a touch of dirt in there. That is our 5-step recipe for getting our compost bin to properly be balanced and break down. So again, the things we had in there: green material, brown material, water, air, and soil. And with that, you should have a compost that breaks down quickly, doesn't have a strong bad smell, and you should have finished compost within about 2 to 4 months, which in Saskatchewan's climate typically means that people who are in a good compost rhythm will be able to harvest finished compost out of their bins once a year, or if they're really keen, twice a year. It's only that much because we do have a big timeout period. All winter, things in the compost bin are just gonna sit and rest and wait, the same as the other plants in the forest and everything else. They're just waiting for spring. So we can still add material all winter, but it's not going to do much until it warms up in the spring. So that's why we only have about 6 to 8 months of compost time in Saskatchewan. Other things to say about compost bins. So I did briefly mention that it really isn't the style or the fanciness of the bin that matters. It's more so just making sure that the contents inside of it are nice and balanced. But I do want to talk a little bit about the different kinds of bins that are available in general. So like I said, some bins tend to be more vertical and you stir them from the top, and that's just fine. The ones you purchase in the store are often made of just form molded plastic. They're fine, they work quite well. They do have a tendency that after 10 or 15 years, they can start get a bit brittle just from being in the sunlight for so long and being plastic. So they're all right, they're fine. There are some as well that are made to turn. We often call them tumbling compost bins. Unfortunately, I don't have a miniature tumbling compost bin. It's something to add to my list for the future. But they often look like a small barrel or a round container that's up on a metal stand, and they can be spun horizontally. And the reason that they can be spun like that is how you mix and stir and add air to them. They work quite well too. They tend to be a fair bit more expensive than every other style of compost bin. And I will say, while they work very well, they don't work better than other kinds of compost bins as long as the other ones are also being watered and stirred. So you can get those if you want. You don't have to. And then this one here, the model that I have here is of a multiple stall compost bin. So sometimes people will design a compost bin to have more than one compartment. So in this case, there's 3 compartments, 1, 2, 3, and you can make 3 different batches of compost at once. The reason a lot of bins are designed this way is having multiple batches of composts going makes it easier to harvest the finished compost. If we just have one container, something like this one here, then our compost will always be a mix of the finished compost on the bottom, the half-finished compost in the middle, and the fresh compost on the top. And if we have a tumbling compost bin, it'll be a mix of all of those things all blended together, not even in layers. But if we have multiple compost bins or multiple chambers to make compost, then we can have one compost pile that's the oldest, one compost pile that's half finished, and one compost pile that's fresh. And this means that when it's time to actually take soil out, instead of having to separate it from the material that's not finished, we can just take the whole pile of the oldest compost and empty it right out because it's all ready to go. So that's one reason that people will have multiple stalls. The other is just if they need a lot of volume. Say they're composting all of the material for a big community garden or for a whole high school or something like that, then they just need a lot of room. Because the second thing to think about with your compost bin is just, is it big enough for you? It's really annoying to have a compost bin that's too small and you fill it up with compost and then you have nowhere to put your compost for the next few weeks until more of it breaks down. And so if you're finding that your compost is getting too full, you may simply need a second one or a larger one, and that's just fine. So anything else I wanted to say about the bins themselves? Oh yes, one thing. We would like to put them on a natural surface where extra liquid can sink into the ground. Because we water compost and because food waste and plant waste itself has a lot of water in it, as it's composting, a little bit of liquid will come out the bottom of any compost bin, even a tumbling compost bin. And if we have it on top of something like asphalt or concrete, it's going to make a little bit of a mess around it. But if we put it on top of dirt or grass or mulch or in the woods, then the extra liquid can just sink into the ground and the nutrients in it can be used by the plants around it. So on a natural surface is good. The last thing I'll mention, because people ask this about compost bins all the time, is that you can put it in full sun, you can put it in part sun, you can put it in full shade. They are all okay. The only difference it really makes is in how fast the compost thaws out in the spring. If it's in full shade, it'll take it a little longer to warm up and to start to compost again. If it's in full sun, it'll warm up faster. Although the full sun compost bin also might need a little more water during the summer. So it's just a trade-off. If you don't have a lot of space for gardening, say if you're somewhere that has a lot of trees, there's a lot of shade, and you've only got a little bit of space where you get good sun, I would do the garden there and put the compost bin in whatever's left over. That's just fine. So these are the basics of compost bins. I have heard that we might have some questions to answer.
Yes, we're going to pause briefly for questions and perhaps if you want to take a brief break and have a glass of water.
Oh, sure.
As provided. And yes, go ahead with questions.
Okay, so these come from our viewers online. First question, does the ink on the paper matter if you're composting paper?
Very good question. So, short answer is these days, no, which is really nice. It used to be that, especially newspaper ink, people were advised not to compost the colored newspaper ink because it's petroleum based and had weird things in it. These days, from everything I've read, the ink on newspaper and other paper tends to be more soy based. And while it's not 100% harmless, the amount of chemicals in it is so small that it really doesn't cause any actual harm in the garden. So we say we get more benefit out of the composting the paper than harm from the ink on it. So we mostly just don't worry about it.
Okay. Then you discussed bins. So of course, lots of our viewers are from the north.
Yes.
So bears are a
Yes,
concern.
okay.
So we're wondering about steel bins, other
Right.
alternatives, these kind of things. Bear protections.
Yes, so that's a very fair point. I hadn't talked about animals in bins very much yet. When it comes to small animals that aren't super strong, like mice and stuff like that, all you need to do is wet and stir the compost, and that'll scare them off in general, because they like nice, dry, undisturbed compost. They don't like wet, stirred compost. But when it comes to bigger, more assertive animals, and most especially black bears and sometimes grizzly bears, of course, they have an amazing sense of smell, and they're always interested in rummaging or foraging. So there are very similar challenges to composting in bear country as there are to storing garbage in bear country. And for that reason, you generally have to think about making something that is in some way bear proof. And I've seen different ways to do this. One is that there are places that simply only do their compost inside of a fenced area with a bear-proof fence, and in the same place they actually store their garbage there as well. A second way, if you're looking for a bear-proof container, there are some metal or steel compost bins available, and you can also, of course, if you're handy and if you know what you're doing, you can build things out of metal. Certainly, they need some holes for air, but they don't need to be big. They can be very small holes for air. I've also seen, more commonly even, compost bins built out of very thick pieces of wood, and often that have their 4 corner posts sunk into the ground, so the compost bin can't be tipped over, which is the other question to do with bears, of course, because if they can't get into it, the next thing they're going to try is, can I tip it over? It is still, I can't lie, it's still a challenge. It's figuring out how to make sure that that your compost bin and your compost area isn't somewhere bears can get a meal, because if they can get a meal once, they'll come back. So, yeah.
Okay. And then last question, how long, I'm not sure if you mentioned it, but how long to go from like spring thaw to having useful soil in your compost?
Right.
And what happens if you use your compost too early, like it's not fully broken down? Is that
Of course.
doable?
Okay, so the amount of time it takes to be full and breaking down varies a little based on what we're putting into it. But in general, from spring thaw until finished compost, if you're starting right then, to be safe, it can be done in as little as 2 months, but that's quite rare. I'd say generally you'd want to wait 3 or 4 months before looking for your finished compost. So if we're thawing out really thoroughly in May, it might be maybe August or September when we want to get our finished compost out of there. One thing to quickly say as well, though, finished compost also doesn't go off or degrade or anything, so it's fine if you leave it for a while, even years, before you use it. On the flip side, if your compost is only, say, half broken down, and it's actually usually quite easy to tell. I'll talk about how to recognize finished compost. The circumstances you use it will matter into whether that matters or not. If you're spreading half finished compost in the fall when the plants are mostly done, that's fine. It'll finish off over the fall, over the spring, and by the time you're planting in the spring, it'll be just fine. The other thing is, if you're using half finished compost but on plants that are quite mature and strong and hardy, they'll be fine too. So on
trees or shrubs or even well-grown large tomato plants, stuff like that, they'll be okay. The one thing that's true is that little baby seedlings and plants that are just coming up, they tend to be, you know, the same as baby humans and baby animals. They're sensitive. And if you put compost on them that isn't fully finished, sometimes it'll mean they won't germinate or they won't grow as well. So if you're growing little tiny baby sensitive plants, make sure your compost is nice and finished. But if you're growing big tough plants, they'll be fine either way. There's no real harm in putting it on unfinished. In fact, one of the ways of composting that I'm going to talk about later involves just digging a hole in your garden, putting fresh food waste in there and covering it up. So you can see in that way that it wouldn't be harming the plants. Do we have any more questions? Not right now? Okay, then what time have we got? I want to make sure that I'm not.
You have 30 minutes.
30 minutes. Okay, then I will wrap up on compost bins and start talking about vermicompost because that one's super fun. Last things I want to say about compost bins. One is that under some circumstances, you may find compost in compost bins will heat up. This isn't actually just from the sun, it's mostly from the microbes. If we have a great big pile of compost, like say a whole cubic meter or something like that, and it's got good conditions, nice mix of greens and browns, lots of water, lots of air, then the microbes can thrive so much that they actually multiply to the point where each little microbe is making a little bit of heat, and all the trillions of them together can make enough heat to change the temperature of the compost. And it can go from ambient air temperature all the way up to about 60 to 70 degrees Celsius, which is quite hot. This doesn't usually happen in home compost bins because generally the piles we have in them are too small. And so they just amble along at regular air temperature, and that's just fine too. But if we have a really big pile of compost and we go to stir it, we might actually find steam coming out of it, and that's just a sign that the microbes are going really, really well. Hot compost processes especially fast. It finishes very quickly. It can also be hot enough that sometimes people can use hot compost piles to even process things that are a little trickier or more dangerous to compost, like meat products, or like things like dog waste or things that could have E. coli or other nasty bacteria in them. Because if we're sure that we can get our compost pile to 60 or 70 degrees and keep it there for a couple of days, bad bacteria like Listeria, E. coli, and Salmonella dies. They don't like those high temperatures. So sometimes hot composting is used to deal with nasty stuff, but it's not usually what we're doing when we're doing this at home. Okay, so that's for compost bins, and I'm just going to clear some of these compost bin type props out of the way so that I can talk about vermicompost. That over there. All right. Oh, I lied. I have one more thing to say, which is about how to recognize finished compost. So, finished compost has some pretty particular characteristics. The first one, and this is going to sound silly when I say it, is it looks like dirt. But what I mean by that is all of the soft materials like banana peels, apple cores, green grass clippings, you shouldn't see them anymore. Shouldn't even be able to recognize them anymore. They're just completely gone, vanished. There will still be recognizable bits of tougher materials. So like I said earlier, you'll probably still see a peach pit. You'll probably still see a stick, a pine cone, maybe a corn cob, perhaps some eggshells. These things just rot a little slower. And so in your finished compost, you'll just still have little bits of them. And that's totally normal. Doesn't hurt the compost at all, doesn't hurt the plants at all, still fine to use. If you really want your compost to not have chunks, then you just put it through a screen or a sieve to take all the chunks out, and they can go back into the compost bin. A second thing, other than it looks like dirt because it is brown and crumbly, is that if you were to take a handful of finished compost, people always give me weird looks when I do this, but I'm going to keep doing it, and you smell it, That's a very quick way to know if your compost is done or not, because smelling compost tells you exactly what the microbes are doing in there. If it smells like earth, the smell of walking through the woods after a rain, the smell of digging up a hill of potatoes, if it smells like dirt, like earth, it's done. It's ready. It's good to use. If there is a sharp, sour smell or a sharp, swampy smell, that is a sign that it's not quite ready to use. And it also likely means that your compost might be a little bit lacking in air. You might want to try to stir your compost a little bit more. If it has just sort of the normal, you know, rotting banana peel smell, which is just sort of a smell of rot, that just means it's not finished at all. It's not an air problem. Sharp, sour, swampy smells, probably more air. Banana rotty smells, just give it more time. This is the main way to recognize it. It should look like dirt and it should smell like dirt. And then we know it's ready. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about vermicompost. It told me it was okay to spread a little bit of dirt around, so this is my little bit of dirt that I've spread around. Hopefully I won't get in trouble for that. Talking about vermicompost. So this is a second way that's really, really easy to process food waste into finished compost. The big difference about vermicompost is I don't have to bring in a little miniature model to show you. This is an actual vermicompost right here. So you can see they're small, they're compact, they're neat, and the biggest thing is they're generally done indoors. The best temperature for vermicomposting is right around room temperature, about 20 degrees. They can go a little colder. They can function as low as about 10 degrees Celsius. Between 0 and 10, the worms don't die, but they do get real sleepy, and so they don't process a lot of food waste. And then between 20 and 30, they're just fine. And then above 30 degrees, the worms start to get a little stressed as well. So because they like room temperature so much, and because the bin is small and neat and doesn't cause any odor or any pest issues, we usually just do vermicompost right inside. And so it can be really neat as a teaching tool for classrooms, as a thing in office break rooms. People can have them in their homes, they can have them in apartments, just basically anywhere, because they don't need a big outdoor space to work. You can also buy vermicompost bins. The ones you purchase tend to have stacking layers and be a little taller. So they'll have one tier and then another on top. When we do it ourselves and make our own, it typically looks like this, where it's just a single tub, not too deep, but pretty wide and shallow. And the way it works is here we're trying to create a balance, and we're trying to create the right environment. But in this case, it's not just the right environment for bacteria and fungus. What we're trying to create is the right environment for the special guest of our vermicompost, earthworms. And in particular, there's a few different species you can use, but the most common species of earthworms used for this is called red wiggler earthworms, or Cynia fetida. I can't speak Latin. That was probably pronounced wrong. But the reason that we have to use a particular kind of earthworms, and this is here, now we get to have an earthworm lesson. There are many, many kinds of earthworms on the planet. There's hundreds of kinds of earthworms, and they aren't even all closely related to each other. Some of them aren't closely related at all, but there's a lot of kinds of earthworms, and they have different kinds of behaviors. In particular, some earthworms, including the ones that live here in Saskatchewan, need a lot of room to burrow up and down in the soil. To do their life cycle, they have to be able to go down 3 or 4 feet in the soil to hibernate through the winter, and to go down a couple of feet in the summer to get away from the hot dirt. And they'll only come up to the surface when they're feeding, basically. And that's what we have here in Saskatchewan. We have burrowing earthworms. And that's great, and they do a wonderful job in the environments that they're native to, in cycling food waste and in creating a nice healthy dirt. But they don't do well in a vermicompost bin. Because as you can see, a vermicompost bin doesn't have 3 to 4 feet to burrow up and down, and so it's just not the right environment for that. So if we want to make sure that the worms in a vermicompost bin are going to do well, what we have to do is pick a species that's a surface-feeding earthworm. And so surface-feeding earthworms are ones that even in nature would spend their whole life in the top, basically, 6 inches of soil.
and they would never really go deeper than that because they feel just fine in a little tub. They're not cramped. It's completely natural for them. And so the main species, like I said, that we use for this is called red wigglers. They're also sold as a bait worm, I think, for trout fishing, and some people use them.
Recess, sorry.
Recess, we're leaving. No, sorry. Some people use them for feeding chickens and stuff like that. But there are a few other species that are sold for vermicomposting, things like European night crawlers or African night crawlers. It just has to be a surface feeding species of earthworm. The one annoying thing about that is it does mean that if you're getting started vermicomposting for the first time, you can't just go outside and dig up your own earthworms, not here in Saskatchewan, because we don't have the right kind. You won't find the right kind. So to get started vermicomposting, you need to either know somebody who's already doing it and ask them very nicely if they will split their population of worms in half and give some to you, or you can contact one of the hobbyists or companies that raise red wriggler earthworms for sale, and they can send some to you either through the mail or if they live close by, just by delivery. Once you purchase worms once, you'll never have to do it again, well, unless something goes terribly wrong, because the worms in the bin live a long time, and if they're happy in the bin, they'll reproduce and they'll create more baby worms, and you'll just have an ecosystem going that'll sustain itself, which is what you'd really like to have. So now to actually get into it. So this vermicompost bin has been continuously composting for about, well, at least 10 years, actually. I inherited it from somebody, not, well, that's a weird way to say it. I got it at my office job, and the previous person who had my job had it before me. So it's been going a long time. Currently, it's very, very light because it was just emptied. But over time, it will fill up with worm castings, which is to say the actual compost. And it'll get much heavier when it becomes full because damp compost weighs a lot. But right now it's very, very light and pretty empty. So what have we got here? We've got a cup, we've got a lid, and as you can see, our lid has a lot of holes, which again is just for airflow, so that lots of air can come and go from the compost. One of the things kids usually ask me is, wait a minute, there's holes in the lid. Aren't the worms going to escape? The good news there is the worms are not interested in escaping. They like the environment of the bin. It's relatively dark, it's damp, there's lots of food, it's safe. That's what worms like, and so they generally try to stay in there. It's very similar to if you had a goldfish in a fish tank. It generally doesn't want to come out of the fish tank because the world outside of the fish tank is less ideal for it. So you can have holes in the container, that is fine. The worms are not trying to escape. Inside of here, I have, well, first of all, I have a digging spoon. You don't have to have a digging spoon, but it is really, really nice. If you're going to have a digging spoon, I recommend getting something that has nice, round, blunt edges, not sharp. You don't want to be hurting any worms when you're looking around. And then inside of the bin itself, what I have is a lot of paper bedding on top. So I have a variety of different kinds of paper. And here I've got newspaper, I've got paper bags, I've got napkins, paper towels, all torn up. You can use almost any kind of carbon-rich brown material as your bedding for the worms. I've seen people use chopped straw, I've seen people use leaves, I've even seen people use peat moss, and that can be just fine. The reason a lot of times that we use paper is that paper doesn't tend to have any extra insects from outside on it. Okay, and so if we use something like leaves, we might bringing in a few ladybugs and centipedes and things like that, whereas paper doesn't tend to bring those with it. And so underneath the paper is where we will have two things, well, three things. Food waste. So when I get my food waste, I would put it underneath the paper and cover it up. I'll show you how that works in a minute. And then the worms eat it, and it goes through the digestive system, and it comes out as worm manure, or I should say, really as dirt or soil at that point. Earthworms are neat in that their poop is just dirt, actually, and in fact is actually very, very fertile compost that can be used to add all kinds of nutrients and benefits to your soil. So what we've got in here is just a little bit of soil. Like I said, it's been very recently emptied. So Well, I'm fine with putting my hand in. I brought gloves along just in case people were grossed out, but you're just going to have to deal with it. So we have a lot of soil in here. That is what the worms are starting to make out of the apple cores and banana peels and carrot peelings and everything that I've given them. And this soil will be ready to use anytime that I want, and I'll tell you about how to harvest it. Oh, yes, I can come closer. How close can I come? I don't want to gross people out.
Do gross them out.
Oh, do gross them out. Okay.
Show them the
I've
worms.
given impression. I've given permission. So here is one red wiggler earthworm. You can see they're quite small compared to our native prairie earthworms. The other reason I'm okay having this guy on my hand is they're completely harmless. They can't do anything to harm a living animal or a human. They can't bite, they're not parasitic, they have no dangerous bacteria, got no venom, so 100% harmless. In fact, he is at my mercy right now. So if anyone's scared, it's the earthworm. All they do all the time is eat decaying dead matter, like leaves, plants, grass, food waste, that kind of stuff. That's their whole life, and turn it into soil. They have no other job. And so to get a vermicompost bin started, you get a tub, you get some paper bedding, you get some red wiggler earthworms, either from somebody who's already doing it, or again, from a company that's selling them, or from a local supplier or something like that. If you're looking for somebody in your area, contact the Saskatchewan Waste Reduction Council. We'll do our best to let you know if we have any contacts in the area. And so once we have that, we make sure the paper bedding is covering them up. There's two reasons for this. One, the worms are much more comfortable in the dark. And two, it helps keep away fruit flies. If we have the food waste sitting right on the surface, sometimes we get fruit flies. With paper bedding, it doesn't tend to happen. And then, when we have food waste to put in there, such as from our kitchen bin, we would simply move the paper to one side, use your digging spoon if you want to, dump some of that food waste in there, and then cover it up again with the rest of the paper bedding. And that's it. And then the worms will break it down. The only things to keep in mind are that we don't want to overwhelm the worms with food. The amount of food that this can process isn't to do with how big the bin is. It's about how many hungry worms are there in there. So the worms can eat about half to their full body weight in a day, which is great to say, but who knows how much they actually weigh unless you pick out every worm and weigh them. So what we often will do is on the outside of the bin, we'll mark a few spots. We'll put number 1, number 2, number 3, 4, 5, 6. And the first time we bury food waste, we'll put it where the 1 spot is. The second time we'll put it in the 2 spot, and then 3, 4, 5 will go around. And if by the time we get back to spot number 1, there's still a fair amount of undecomposed food waste there, we know that we either need to feed them less food waste or to get a second order of worms and add that in too. So more worms or less food. The nice thing is the worms do tend to increase their population over time. Not in a dangerous way. You never get so many worms that there's too many in their ecosystem. So over time, you can add more food. How are we doing for time?
You got about 10 minutes.
Okay, wonderful. So getting started with this is very, very easy and simple. The next question, of course, is how do you actually harvest the vermicastings or the compost out of a vermicompost? And the answer to that is that we take advantage of the worms' natural behaviors. And they have basically 2 things that we can use. 1, they'll move to where the food is. And 2, they'll move away from light. So we can use this in one of 2 ways. Either we can make it so we start feeding the worms on only one side of the bin. And we do that for maybe a whole month or even longer. After that point, 85%, 90% of the worms will have all moved over to the side with the fresh food. And at that point, we can go in and simply remove the other half, which will be almost entirely finished compost and nothing else. That's a really simple way to do it. A second way, if you're in more of a hurry, and if you want to harvest the whole bin at once, is that you'll take the bin, you'll put some paper or a tarp down, you'll empty the whole thing onto a table somewhere where there's bright light.
It can be sunlight, it can be indoor light, you just need to have bright light, and spread the material out so it's only about 2 inches thick. The worms will go to the bottom because they don't like light. So at first, if you look over, you'll see plenty of earthworms all over the surface, but if you come back in 10 minutes, they'll all be gone, and it's because they're at the bottom now, they're hiding. And that means that the top is just composted, so you can go through and skim the top centimeter or 2 off. And then wait another 10, 15, 20 minutes, and the worms will go even further down, and then you can skim a bit more. And so that's a way to do it, by basically just using light to herd the worms downward. I suppose there is technically a third way, which is really nice, especially if you have, say, a whole class of students that you can get to do it for you, where you just give each person a little pile of dirt and worms and tell them worms go here, dirt goes there, and separate them out that way. I don't recommend doing that yourself because it can be a little bit of work, but if you have 30 grade 9 students, that's a good way to do it. Very quick, very fast. And so that's how we do it with this bin. Other things to keep in mind. One thing is, so we don't need to balance browns and greens in a vermicompost bin. We mostly just feed it food waste. The only thing is occasionally we will top up the paper or leaf or straw bedding, which is on top, because it will slowly break down into the compost. But that's only maybe every couple of months that we'll add a little bit more. If you have a paper shredder, feel free to use it. I don't, so I use my own shredder, which is my fingers, and just tear things into smaller bits. A second thing is, if you ever do, something went wrong, the food waste sat on top for a while, and now, there's fruit flies or there's fungus gnats or something like that. There's a couple different ways to get rid of them, to control them. And I will say there's one that's really easy and effective, but it relies on having a certain product. And the other way is accessible to basically anyone. So the way that's very effective, but you do have to have a certain thing, is that if you have any gardening or hydroponic gardening store or company anywhere in your area, ask them if they carry predatory nematodes. It's a biological product that has a species of microscopic predatory worms in it that only eat the fly larvae but don't harm earthworms. And so you can add them in, and basically they'll eat up all the fly larvae, the flies will be gone, your earthworms will be fine. That's making sure that you can actually buy predatory nematodes in your area. If you can't, the best thing to do usually is to set up some vinegar traps to catch the adult flies and kill them. So this is just a jar with a little funnel of paper going into it and a couple inches of apple cider or rice vinegar, or even just regular vinegar but with a bit of sugar in the bottom. And it'll attract the flies, whoop, and they will drown. So that can also be effective. So this is for vermicompost bin. Is there anything else I want to mention? So we don't need to balance browns and greens. We don't need to add an extra soil. It actually already gets plenty of air on its own, as long as we make sure that the lid has lots of holes in it. The last thing that we might have to think about is moisture. So we want to make sure the worms don't dry out. They're a lot like a frog in that they breathe air, but also their skin needs to be damp. They need both of these things. So we can't have them sitting in water or they'll drown. But we also can't have them in a super dry bin or they'll dry up. And so we want the bin to be damp. The way we can do that is occasionally we'll just have a look in the bin. And if the paper on top is a little bit damp, that's okay. And especially if the material at the bottom looks a little damp, there's a little bit of water down there, that's perfect. If it's a little too dry, you can either carefully add just 1/8 of a cup of water. You don't want to add too much because, again, you don't want to drown them. Or if you have a spray bottle, you can just and give them a little bit of a misting, like a nice Boston fern, and that'll keep them nice and happy. In terms of how often we harvest out of a vermicompost bin, it's surprisingly not terribly often. You can be feeding them a fair amount of food and it'll compact and compact and compact. We often only need to take castings out maybe every 3 to 6 months or even less. With this bin, I will admit, I don't feed it as much as I should. I should feed it more often. So I only have to harvest about once a year. Whoops. take better care of your worms than I do. Yeah, sorry. All right, so I actually want to mention here, just quickly, I have the materials to put a second vermi bin together, which I could do on screen if we have time.
Sure. Can we do questions? Two quick
Yeah, let's do
questions?
questions. Questions first.
We can run a little over time.
So
Recess.
long bell.
Recess is over, right?
Yeah.
Okay, first question. So somebody asked about Vitamix food cyclers, like countertop systems.
Yeah.
And then, so I was wondering what your opinions on those. And then also, if there's some sort of intermediate step between like an at-home food cycler and one that would be appropriate for a school, larger environment.
Right. Okay. So, yeah, sometimes we call these units countertop composters or food dehydrators, but basically they're electric appliances about the size of a bread machine that you're meant to put 3 or 4, well, between 1 and 4 liters of food waste in at a time, and they run in batches, and they're usually done in about 6 to 12 hours. The thing I want, and one kind is the Vitamix food cycler. There's also a Vitamix Eco 5. You may have heard of a Lomi. It's the same kind of a thing. The one thing I want to emphasize is they don't actually process things into finished compost. It looks a bit the same. It's usually kind of brown, kind of crumbly after, but it looks less like dirt than it does like kind of fluffy food powder. And that's because what these machines actually do is they dehydrate and they pulverize the material, but they don't have the time or the right conditions to be able to transform it using microbes, which is what actually happens in compost. So it's not soil yet, it's not finished compost, but it does take food waste that is wet and heavy and like actively going to be molding and rotting and stuff, and it changes it into light, easy to store, not actively rotting powder. So the one thing that we have seen is sometimes schools or businesses or even apartment buildings will use something like a Lomi or a Vitamix food cycler to just take food waste and turn it into powder, and then they'll store the powder in a 5-gallon bucket or something, and they only have to worry about emptying the bucket every 6 or 7 or 8 months, because it's not rotting in the same way. And so they'll take the bucket to a local community garden and bury it, or they'll take it to somebody's organic curbside pickup, or they'll take it to a compost bin of a member of the community. But it just means that instead of having to empty their food waste container every 3 or 4 days, they only need to really make sure to get rid of it every several months. So it's a way to basically put your food waste in a timeout, so you don't have to handle it all the time. And it works just great to take the food powder and bury it in a garden. Then it finishes processing from the soil microbes, or put it in a regular compost bin. Just don't treat it like compost yet, because it is a little different. If you just get it wet again, it'll actually just go moldy. Yeah.
Okay. And then the other question is, we did a previous session on tower gardens, and some of our schools were given a tower garden that has garden towers that have the tube for vermicompost in them.
Yeah.
So any tips for the tower, the garden tower?
Right.
Composting?
I have to admit, and this is a regret of mine, I have so far never got to personally use one of those worm towers for gardening. So I can't give personal advice on how to do it. In the same way, I try to keep the vermicompost in a good balance, which is to say damp but not super wet, which might be a little trickier in the tower because you might expect it to be wetter near the bottom. So I guess you would try not to overwater. And other than that, just try to feed the worms an amount that they can handle and keep up with. And it's really is just sort of a vermicompost bin, but in a very different shape. Yeah.
Okay. We'll give you about 5 minutes to wrap things up, and then we're going to do our draw for the vermicompost bin.
Okay, so in that case, with my last 5 minutes, rather than put together another bin, because I've already shown you, you have a bin, you have some paper, you have some worms, some food waste, that's it. I'm going to talk just quickly about other methods. I love that somebody already brought up the countertop composters, because that was one of the things that I wanted to mention. And again, the biggest thing there is it takes your food waste, it just makes it into a light, easy to store, not rotting form that you can then deal with less often, whether you take it to wherever it's going eventually. But it doesn't fully make compost. Other things you can do though, a trench compost, which is when you dig down 6 or 8 inches into the soil. If you don't have that depth of soil, then you can sometimes get away with mounding soil on top instead. You put just straight food waste or green materials in the bottom. Don't have to balance the greens and browns. You can just put in whatever you like. And then you cover it up with about 6 inches of soil. And in that case, you're just saying, hey, soil microbes, hey, soil insects, could you break this down for me? And as long as there's a nice, healthy ecosystem of microbes and insects down there, they'll do it. You don't have to water it. You don't have to stir it. The only thing about it is you don't get to move the compost afterward. It fertilizes where you dug it and nowhere else. So that can work. Obviously, it doesn't work great in winter, but it can be just fine in spring, summer, and fall. Another method I'll mention very briefly is something called Bokashi Composting. This one is very unusual. It's very different than other forms of composting because it has 2 steps. And in the first one, we're following a completely different microbial process. Rather than what we call aerobic decomposition is technically what's happening in a compost bin, which is that microbes are decomposing things using air. Bokashi starts deliberately with something called anaerobic, so no air, fermentation, which isn't exactly the same. It's sort of, so the first step is almost more like making sauerkraut than compost. And then the second step is what we're used to as regular composting. So the way Bokashi works is that you would have some kind of a sealed container. Most commonly, it's just a 5-gallon bucket. And you add layers of food waste into it, along with an inoculant called Bokashi bran. Bokashi bran has a particular blend of anaerobic microbes on it that make the right thing happen. You fill it up, you let it ferment for at least 2 weeks, can be as much as several months, and then after that, you compost the fermented food waste. The reasons people might do this, one is, again, it lets you take your food waste out less often because it gets stored in the pail for a long time. 2 is that you can put things like chicken bones and meat and cheese and dairy into a Bokashi bucket. The fermentation helps it to break down. And the last one is it can be a very quick way to compost in that the fermentation in the bucket can take as little as 2 to 3 weeks. And then after that, when you put it outside in a compost bin or trench compost, it can take as little as 4 to 6 weeks for it to finish breaking down. So it can be as little as about 2 months at a time. However, there are also some big reasons that this isn't what most people do, including myself. This isn't what I do. One, it's a little fussy. It's got 2 steps instead of 1. And 2, you have to purchase something. You have to buy buckets, and you have to buy Bokashi brand. I don't like buying stuff. I'm very cheap. And 3, because it's deliberately an anaerobic process, the fermentation part, it smells stinky. It smells sour, like making like beer mash or like sauerkraut. And so for a lot of people, this isn't their favorite way to do it, but there are a few who find it to be really convenient for them, and it lets them put all of their food waste in the compost, including chicken bones. So for that reason, it can be a good thing to know about, but it has to be specifically what you're looking at. Those are the main methods I wanted to talk about. I guess now I'll turn it over to questions.
I don't believe we have any more questions, but I've asked people to turn on their mics.
Oh, for sure.
And they can ask questions at that point or provide some feedback to you.
Okay.
So,
And in the meantime, we'll do our draw. So I've got the names. Where's this little bin? This is my favorite bin.
Oh, use that one. Okay, yes, I have a miniature
okay,
bin bin.
so
Tiny green bin.
Tiny green bin.
Putting the names in.
Close it, pick it up.
leave it till the end.
Okay.
Okay.
We have Sheridan Long John from Macassagigan School. Sheridan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the awesome presentation. I learned a lot from your composting. We're just doing small time composting at the school, but it was very informative. Thank you very much.
Sorry, Sheridan, I don't have the speaker as loud as I should. Could you repeat the question?
No, I'm going to come closer.
Oh, no, I just wanted to say thank you for the awesome presentation.
Thank you for the awesome presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, Dan Matzker from Lined Up. Dan?
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're great, Dan.
All right. I just wanted to say we're interested in composting. We haven't started yet. So it's something that we want to start. And also the garden tower, we have that orange one. We want to use the red wigglers in there, and then we have to kind of find out where to get a hold of some of those. So that's my question. Where can I get some red wiggler worms?
Okay, thank you, Dan. Cassie?
Yeah, thanks so much, Lisa. That was really interesting. And this recording is going to be a great resource to have to share with the schools, because I know the interest in composting is definitely gaining. So yeah, I really appreciate that. Thank you.
And Tammy.
Hi, thank you so much, Lisa, for coming out and sharing what you know so much about. It's really always so interesting to hear what you have to say. I've been a long time composter, but I'm not a perfectionistic in the way that I approach it. So it's always nice to hear about, you know, what's green and brown and mixing it, and just kind of the long journey of continuing to do it better. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And if you could answer Dan.
Yes, I can do
Maybe
that.
come around the long way.
You can't quite see our setup in here, but there's a few cables to go around.
We've got a lot of cables going.
All right. Okay, well, thank you so much for those comments. Let me think. I want to answer a couple of them. So in terms of where to get red wiggler earthworms, the best thing, well, the first thing that I'll mention is the nonprofit I work for, the Saskatchewan Waste Reduction Council. We try to keep track of everyone we know in Saskatchewan who is raising red wigglers for sale. And we have a list on our website. It's not on the front page or anything, but if you go to www.swrc.ca, Saskatchewan Waste Reduction Council, and then click compost, one of the links at the side says Vermicompost suppliers. And we have listings of both all of the people we know in Saskatchewan who are raising them for sale, many of whom will ship if it's to a more, if it's not in their community. And there are also a couple of Canada-wide companies. One's based in BC, one's based in Ontario, because of course they are, but they'll ship through the mail, which is very reliable, but I would recommend not doing it in winter because of the risk that your worms may show up frozen. So I would only do that in the summer. So it's mostly, I would check those places, and even potentially in the chat, we could drop you the link later.
Tammy has put a link to the Saskatchewan Waste
Good,
Reduction
wonderful.
in the chat.
The second thing I wanted to just quickly say is actually a response to Tammy, where you're mentioning that you're not a perfectionist, and that made me remember something that I wanted to say. I want to be clear. You don't have to be a perfectionist to compost. I've given you this 5-step recipe for how to make a really balanced compost bin, but the fun secret is you can forget all of it and eventually your compost will still work anyway. Nature is really, really good at taking plant material and old dead material and turning it back into soil. It's been doing it for a few billion years. And so even if you're not watering and stirring and balancing, eventually everything turns back into soil. You don't need to worry about it too much. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. I think we had more of a crowd than we will clap for you. There's only a couple of us here.
Thank you.
I would like to thank Lisa Howse for coming to share her wisdom, her knowledge with us, and the Saskatchewan Waste Reduction Council for allowing her to be here. MLTC and our tech guys, Jan and Khalid, thank you so much for coming all the way down to Saskatoon. Tammy at MLTC was part of the School Food Development Project for getting this all organized. Awesome. I think we all learned a lot. This is going to put our schools on track to really get started with the composting. So last thing to do